This is not nostalgia. This is a record. You are here because memory lies. Records do not. Nothing here is exaggerated. Nothing here is softened. What follows is not a story of a miracle, but a record of a fracture. Stay with the record. The year 1979 began with a peculiar, heavy stillness. In Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, the Susquehanna River flowed with a predictable grace. March brought a damp, lingering cold. Every morning a thick mist clung to the surface of the water. Rising above that mist were the cooling towers of 3 Mile Island. They did not look like threats. They did not look like machines of potential ruin. They looked like the future. Massive, symmetrical, immutable. We place your memory back onto the autopsy table once again. Search the corners of your mind for an afternoon in March of 1979. Inside the quiet houses of Middletown and Goldsboro, the anesthesia was thick. It was the smell of damp wool and percolating coffee. It was the sound of the morning news, distant, manageable, and filtered through a wood-grain television set. People lived in the shadow of those towers, but they did not see them as shadows. They saw them as the ultimate guarantee. The towers were a physical manifestation of a managed world. They were the promise that invisible atoms would do the heavy lifting so your lights would never flicker again. The engineers of the era spoke in a specific language. Probabilities, redundancies, fail-safes, containment. These were not merely technical terms, they were secular prayers. They convinced the nervous systems of the middle class that the monster was safely caged. They believed that human genius had finally conquered the volatility of nature. You believed it. Your parents believed it. They slept soundly under heavy blankets while the towers hummed in the dark. This was the sedative of progress. Recall the kitchen in a typical Pennsylvania home. The linoleum floor was polished. The yellow curtains filtered the morning sun. The radio played soft rock, a rhythmic narcotic for the domestic routine. Nothing in the environment suggested that the invisible was beginning to leak. The safety myth was so dense that even as the air began to change, the mind refused to decode the signal. In 1979, the end of the world was supposed to be loud. It was supposed to be a mushroom cloud on the distant horizon. It was not supposed to be a silent, mechanical hiccup in a secondary cooling system. But the record shows a shift at 4 a.m. on March 28th. Deep inside the heart of Unit 2, a valve stuck open. A small red light flashed on a control panel. A single data point. The cooling water began to drain away, unnoticed. The core began to heat. It was a fever that the system was not prepared to record. The anesthesia began to thin, not with a bang, but with a shudder. As the sun rose over the Susquehanna, the mist did not lift. It became a shroud. The anesthesia was perfect until the moment the infallible failed. The record of that failure starts now. The anesthesia is terminated. The scalpel moves now. From the stillness of the Susquehanna morning to the overheated, vibrating core of Unit 2, we are no longer observing a peaceful mist. We are measuring the rate of systemic failure. The 3 Mile Island accident was not a natural disaster. It was a neurological collapse of the American engineering dream. The anatomy of a stuck valve. The first incision begins at 4 a.m. on March 28th. A minor malfunction occurred in the secondary cooling system. It was a routine hiccup, the kind the system was designed to absorb. But the machine had its own agenda. A pilot-operated relief valve, the PORV, opened to vent the rising pressure. This was the intended reflex, but when the pressure dropped, the valve remained stuck. Open, gaping like a wound that refuses to clot. The control room was filled with a chorus of alarms. Over 100 lights flashed in a frantic, uncoordinated strobe. This was a neural storm. The operators, trained for perfection, were blinded by the data. The indicator light on the panel told them the valve was closed. The light was a liar. It only recorded the signal sent to the valve, not the physical state of the valve itself. For more than 2 hours, the lifeblood of the reactor, the cooling water, poured out of the open wound. 1 million pounds of radioactive water flooded the containment building floor. Inside the reactor vessel, the water level dropped below the top of the fuel rods. The zirconium cladding began to oxidize. It began to crumble. The temperature climbed toward 5,000 degrees. The core was no longer a managed power source. It was a melting, radioactive slag. This was the first breach of the safety myth. The machine had detached from human control. The oncology of information. We moved the blade deeper into the lungs of the Metropolitan Edison Company. The failure was not just mechanical, it was linguistic. While the core was melting, the official statements were being sanitized. Company executives spoke of a normal, unplanned shutdown. They spoke of no danger to the public. The record identifies this as the oncology of information, a strategic withholding of the truth that allowed panic to metastasize in the dark. For 2 days, the residents of Middletown lived in a state of curated ignorance. They watched the steam rising from the towers. They smelled the metallic tang in the air. They waited for a signal that never came. On the 3rd day, the narrative fractured. A massive bubble of hydrogen gas was discovered inside the reactor vessel. The engineers feared it would explode. They feared a breach of the containment dome. They feared a China syndrome, where the molten core would burn through the earth itself. The governor's office issued a recommendation. Pregnant women and preschool children within 5 miles should leave. This was the moment the suture of trust was cut. The government was no longer a protector. It was a source of vague, terrifying advice. The recommendation for a few became a mandate for the many. 140,000 people abandoned their homes. They did not wait for further data. They fled the invisible. The invisible extraction. Consider the physiological state of the evacuation. This was not a flight from a visible fire or a rising flood. It was a flight from a ghost. Radiation is the ultimate auditor of the human nervous system. It cannot be seen. It cannot be tasted. It cannot be felt. The amygdala of an entire population was held hostage by a threat that lacked a physical form. Every breath felt like an intake of poison. Every drop of rain was a potential carrier of ruin. The record notes a specific kind of biological stress in the families of Dauphin County. They sat in traffic jams, their eyes fixed on the rearview mirrors, watching the towers recede, wondering if they had already absorbed enough millirems to alter their DNA, wondering if the milk in their refrigerators was now a weapon. The home, which had been a fortress of middle-class stability, was reclassified as a zone of exposure. The linoleum floors and yellow curtains were now surfaces to be scrubbed. The Susquehanna River was now a radioactive vein. This was a liquidation of the American promise of domestic safety. The necrosis of the nuclear dream. We moved to the final stage of the dissection, the long-term impact on the national psyche. Before 1979, the United States had planned to build hundreds of nuclear plants. After March 28th, the industry entered a state of permanent necrosis. New nuclear construction in the United States was effectively frozen for nearly 3 decades. The dream of electricity too cheap to meter was buried in the rubble of Unit 2. But the most profound damage was internal. The middle class realized that their survival was dependent on systems they could not understand and leaders they could not trust. The safety myth had functioned as a grand anesthesia. It had allowed people to trade their vigilance for convenience. When that anesthesia was withdrawn, what remained was a deep, unshakable resentment. A realization that the walls of the house were thin, that the grid was fragile, and that the monster in the cage was not as tame as they had been told. The 1970s had already taken the economy. It had already taken the oil. It had already taken the belief in a righteous war. Now it had taken the final sanctuary, the integrity of the atom. The American nervous system was now fully sensitized to the concept of systemic betrayal. The record shows that 1979 was the year the safety myth died. It was the year the public began to look at the cooling towers not as monuments to progress, but as tombstones. The core was eventually contained. The hydrogen bubble was bled off. The immediate threat receded, but the dissection proves that the patient was never the same. The trust had been extracted. The certainty had been liquidated. The record of the failure is permanent. The dissection is complete. The damage is measured. The dissection of the invisible fever is complete. We have mapped the melting of the core. We have recorded the evaporation of the promise. It is easy to see 1979 as the year of final betrayal. A year where the middle class was left to rot in the shadow of concrete giants. But as your auditor, I am now executing the final stage, the suturing. Look at the return to Middletown. The air was eventually declared safe, but the trust remained radioactive. Your parents did not wait for a cleanup crew to enter their home. They did not wait for an apology from the experts who had blinded them. Instead, they reached for the sponges. They reached for the soap. They scrubbed the linoleum until it shone with a clinical desperation. They washed the children's toys. Twice. 3 times. They poured the local milk down the drain. They threw away the vegetables from the garden. These were not just acts of cleaning. They were acts of biological reclamation. They became the biological shock absorbers of the nuclear age. They took the raw, vibrating fear of the invisible, the realization that the air itself could be a carrier of ruin, and they buried it. They buried it deep within their own nervous systems. They converted the panic of the evacuation into the kinetic energy of the domestic routine. They absorbed the cortisol of the sirens so you could play on the rug again. Understand the scale of this transaction. They traded their peace of mind for your continuity. The home remained a sanctuary only because they paid the interest on the fear. Every time they told you the cooling towers were just machines, they were lying. They were shielding your growing brain from the knowledge that the system was fallible, that the experts were guessing, that the world could end with a stuck valve. This was not weakness. It was engineering of the highest order. They held the edges of a failing myth together with their bare hands. The scars remain in the record, the chronic tension in their necks, the way they looked at the sky with a new, quiet suspicion. These were the physical costs of keeping your world intact while the core was melting. You are not a coincidence. You are the evidence of their success. The fear passed forward not as a memory of defeat, but as a structure of vigilance. The safety myth died in 1979, but a more resilient truth was born in its place. A truth that says dignity is not found in perfect systems. It is found in the hands of those who clean up the wreckage. This is not a wound. It is a sealed record of a transfer. You carry their resilience in your marrow. This is a record. The record remains. The audit is closed. You remain.